My dad
You
is a
think this is
biker, she
funny?
said.
Look at
The
me when I'm
class
talking
laughed
to
until
you.
a hell's angel
Hey,
walked
get
in.
away!
The fluorescent lights of the emergency room flickered overhead, casting pale shadows across the blood-soaked floor. 17 years ago, on a night that would change everything, a man lay dying on a metal gurney. His name was Colt Brennan, and he was 28 years old. He had lived hard, fought harder, and now the consequences of his choices were bleeding out of a hole in his chest. The bullet had entered just below his left shoulder. A rival gang member had pulled the trigger in a bar fight that had gone from shouting to shooting in less than 3 seconds. Colt remembered the flash of the muzzle, the burning impact, and then the cold concrete floor against his cheek. He remembered thinking that this was probably how it would end. Not old and gray, but young and stupid, drowning in his own blood on a dirty floor. Another shot had rang out in that chaos. His brother Wade had thrown himself in front of the second bullet, taking it in the shoulder. Wade had dragged him out of that bar, bleeding from his own wound, refusing to let Colt die alone on that filthy floor. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and pressure on his wound. Someone kept telling him to stay awake, to keep his eyes open, but the darkness at the edges of his vision was spreading like spilled ink. He could feel himself slipping away, could feel the fight leaving his body one heartbeat at a time. Then he saw her. She was standing over him when they wheeled him into the trauma bay. A nurse with steady hands and eyes the color of spring leaves. Her voice cut through the chaos like a lighthouse beam through fog. She grabbed his hand, and her grip was surprisingly strong for such small fingers. "You're going to live," she said. Colt tried to laugh, but it came out as a wet cough. He had seen the wound. He knew how much blood he had lost. But the nurse leaned closer, and her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made him believe her. "You're going to live," she repeated, "but you have to change." Those 5 words would echo in his mind for the next 17 years. They would become his compass, his prayer, his reason for getting up every morning and choosing to be different from the man he had been. Her name was Laurel, and she would become his wife. She would give him a daughter, and then she would die, leaving him to raise that daughter alone. But all of that was still in the future. In that moment, with the surgical lights blazing above him and his life hanging by a thread, Colt Brennan made a promise. He promised that if he survived, if somehow he made it through this night, he would become a man worthy of those green eyes and that steady voice. He would change. And he did. The months that followed were the hardest of his life. Leaving the Hells Angels was not like quitting a job. It was like cutting off a limb, like erasing a part of himself that had defined everything he thought he knew about strength and loyalty and brotherhood. There were threats. There were confrontations in parking lots and phone calls in the middle of the night. Some of his former brothers understood, or at least pretended to. Others, like Wade, took his departure as a personal betrayal that would fester for decades. But Laurel was there through all of it. She held his hand during the withdrawal from the adrenaline-fueled life he had known. She sat with him through the nightmares when he would wake up sweating and shaking, convinced that someone was coming for him. She reminded him day after day that he was worth saving, that the man she saw in him was real, even when he could not see it himself. They married in a small ceremony at the county courthouse, just the two of them and a justice of the peace. Laurel wore a simple white dress, and Colt wore the only suit he owned, borrowed from a friend. There were no guests, no reception, no fanfare, just two people making a promise to each other, a promise that would shape the rest of their lives. A year later, Hadley was born. Colt still remembered the moment he first held his daughter. She was so small, so fragile, with her mother's green eyes and a cry that could wake the entire maternity ward. He had looked down at that tiny face and felt something crack open inside him, something that had been locked away for so long he had forgotten it existed. Love. Pure, unconditional, terrifying love. He had made a second promise that day, a promise he whispered into his daughter's ear while Laurel slept. He promised to be the father that he had never had. He promised to protect her from the darkness that had consumed so much of his own life. He promised to become a man she could be proud of. For 10 years, he kept that promise. He opened a garage honest work that let him use the mechanical skills he had learned in the club. He volunteered at the VA hospital, helping veterans who reminded him of the angry young man he had been. He made pancakes on Sunday mornings and read bedtime stories every night. He was present, devoted, determined to make up for every sin of his past through the simple act of being a good father. Then Laurel got sick. The cancer came fast and cruel, stealing her away in a matter of months. Colt held her hand in the hospice room, watching the light fade from those green eyes that had saved his life all those years ago. Her last words were about Hadley, about making sure their daughter knew how much she was loved. Colt promised. And then Laurel was gone. He had been raising Hadley alone for 10 years now. Some days were easier than others. Some days he could almost forget the weight of his past. But then he would catch a glimpse of his tattooed arms in the mirror, or hear the rumble of a motorcycle passing by, and it would all come rushing back. The man he used to be, the things he had done, the price he would spend the rest of his life trying to pay. The morning sun cast long shadows across the streets of Ridgemont, a small town nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were hard to keep and reputations were even harder to shake. Hadley Brennan walked along the sidewalk with her backpack hanging heavy on her shoulders. She was 15 years old with her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn chin. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she walked with her head slightly down as if she was trying to make herself smaller. The route to Ridgemont High School could have been shorter, much shorter. But Hadley always took the long way, adding 15 minutes to her commute just to avoid passing by her father's garage. The garage where the motorcycles lined up outside like chrome soldiers. The garage where men with leather vests and faded tattoos came and went at all hours. The garage that announced to everyone in town exactly who her father was and where he came from. She could hear the distant rumble of a Harley engine starting up, and she quickened her pace. The sound followed her like a ghost, like a reminder of everything she wished she could leave behind. It was not that she did not love her father, she did. Deeply fiercely in the way that daughters love their fathers even when they do not understand them. But love and embarrassment could exist in the same heart, and Hadley had become an expert at holding both. She remembered the first time she had truly understood what her father used to be. She was 9 years old and she had found a box of photographs hidden in the back of his closet. Pictures of a younger Colt surrounded by men who looked like they could kill you with their bare hands. Pictures of motorcycles and leather and patches that spelled out words she did not fully understand but instinctively feared. She had asked him about it that night, and he had sat her down and told her a story. A story about a boy who had grown up angry and alone, who had found a family in the wrong place, who had done things he was not proud of. A story about a bullet in a hospital and a nurse who had seen something in him that no one else had ever seen. A story about change. Hadley had listened, and she had understood at least as much as a 9-year-old could understand such things. But understanding and accepting were different things. And when she started middle school, when she began to realize how the other kids looked at her, how their parents whispered when her father's name came up, understanding started to feel like a burden she had not asked to carry. Now she was 15, and the burden had only grown heavier. She reached the school gates just as the first bell rang. Students streamed past her laughing and talking in groups. Hadley kept her head down and made her way to her locker, moving through the crowd like a ghost. The hallways of Ridgemont High were the same as any other high school in America. Lockers painted in school colors, motivational posters that no one read, the smell of floor wax and cafeteria food. But for Hadley, these hallways had always felt like a minefield. One wrong step, one careless word, and everything could explode. She opened her locker and began gathering her books for first period. History with Mr. Crawford. Usually it was her favorite class. Mr. Crawford was one of those teachers who actually cared, who tried to make the past feel alive and relevant. But today Hadley had a feeling that history class would not be so simple. She did not know how right she was. The classroom was already buzzing with conversation when Hadley took her seat in the third row. She preferred the middle of the room, not too close to the front where the teachers' pets sat, not too far back where the troublemakers held court. Just somewhere in between, somewhere invisible. Sloane Montgomery sat 2 rows ahead, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the light from the windows. She was the class president, the captain of the dance team, the kind of girl who seemed to have been born with a silver spoon in a superiority complex. Her laugh rang out across the room high and bright as she shared some story with her circle of admirers. Preston Hayes sat in the back corner, his feet propped up on the desk in front of him. His family owned the biggest car dealership in 3 counties, and he never let anyone forget it. He was handsome in a generic way, with the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no. Mr. Crawford entered the room just as the second bell rang. He was a tall man in his 50s with gray at his temples and wire-rimmed glasses that always seemed to be sliding down his nose. He set his briefcase on the desk and clapped his hands to get everyone's attention. "All right, class, settle down," he said, his voice carrying easily over the chatter. "We're going to try something different today." A collective groan rippled through the room. Different usually meant uncomfortable. Different usually meant participation. Mr. Crawford smiled, undeterred by the lack of enthusiasm. "Before we dive into the Civil War," he continued, "I want us to connect with history on a personal level. Each of you comes from a unique background with your own family stories. These personal histories shape who we are, just like major historical events shaped our nation." Hadley's heart began to race. She knew where this was going, and her palms grew damp against the surface of her desk. "So," Mr. Crawford said, settling onto the edge of his desk, "I'd like each of you to share something personal about your families, something that makes them unique or special." Sloane's hand shot up immediately, her bracelet jangling as she raised it high. "My grandfather was a state senator," she announced, not waiting to be called on. "He served 3 terms and was instrumental in education reform in this state. We still have his original desk in our study." Several students nodded appreciatively. Mr. Crawford smiled and made a note. Preston went next, his voice carrying that casual arrogance that seemed to come so naturally to him. "My mom's family came over on the Mayflower," he said with a smirk. "We've got the original documents to prove it. Been in this country longer than this country's been a country." More nods, more impressed murmurs. One by one, students around the room shared their stories. Sarah's aunt was a local news anchor who had won 2 Emmy Awards. Michael's parents owned not just a car dealership, but a chain of them spanning 4 states. Jennifer's grandmother had been a suffragette who had marched for women's right to vote. Each story seemed designed to highlight how different Hadley's life was from theirs. Each story was a reminder of the gap between their worlds and hers. Mr. Crawford's encouraging gaze swept the room, looking for more volunteers. His eyes landed on Hadley, and she felt her stomach drop. "Hadley," he said gently, "would you like to share something about your family?" The room went quiet. Hadley rarely spoke in class, and she could feel the weight of everyone's attention turning toward her like a spotlight. She thought about her father, the man who had turned his life around, the man who worked harder than anyone she knew, the man who had shown her what it meant to be honest and brave, even when the world expected you to be something else. Before she could stop herself, her hand crept up into the air. Mr. Crawford smiled warmly. "Yes, Hadley, please share with us." Hadley swallowed hard. Her throat felt like sandpaper, and her heart was pounding so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. "My dad is a biker," she said quietly. The words were barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the classroom, they might as well have been shouted. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere outside. Then someone snickered. The sound was like a match striking kindling. Suddenly, laughter erupted across the room. Sloane covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking with barely contained giggles. Preston did not even bother to hide his amusement. "Like what a bicycle!" someone called out from the back of the room. More laughter, louder now. "Does he have one of those little bells?" Preston added, making a ringing motion with his hand. "Maybe a basket for groceries." The classroom dissolved into hysterics. Hadley felt her face grow hot, the familiar flush of embarrassment spreading from her cheeks down her neck. She stared at her desk at the scratches and initials carved into its surface by students who had come before her. "Settle down," Mr. Crawford said, but his voice lacked real authority. The damage was already done. "I bet he delivers newspapers," Sloane whispered loudly to her friend, just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Or maybe pizza. Does he have a little flag on the back?" Hadley's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. They did not know her father. They did not know about the charity rides for veterans, the homeless men he had helped get back on their feet the way he volunteered at the local shelter every Thanksgiving. They did not know about the man who made pancakes on Sunday mornings and never missed a parent-teacher conference. They just saw what they wanted to see. A punchline. A joke. Preston pulled out his phone, holding it up at an angle that Hadley recognized immediately. He was recording. Recording the laughter, the mockery, the worst moment of her day. Mr. Crawford noticed too late. Preston put that away. But Preston grinned and kept filming for a few more seconds before slowly sliding the phone back into his pocket. The message was clear. Whatever had just happened, it was going to follow Hadley far beyond this classroom. The rest of the period passed in a blur. Mr. Crawford tried to steer the class back to the Civil War, to battles and strategies and historical significance. But Hadley heard none of it. She sat rigid in her seat, counting the minutes until the bell would ring, until she could escape. When it finally came, she was out of her chair before the sound had finished echoing. She grabbed her books and made for the door, keeping her head down, trying to avoid eye contact with anyone. She almost made it. "Hey, biker girl," Preston called out as she passed him. "Tell your dad I said vroom vroom." His friends laughed. Hadley kept walking. She made it to the bathroom before the first tear fell. She locked herself in a stall and let her backpack drop to the floor, sliding down against the door until she was sitting with her knees pulled up to her chest. This was why she never talked about her father. This was why she took the long way to school, why she changed the subject whenever anyone asked about her family, why she had become so good at being invisible. Because the moment anyone found out the truth, this is what happened. The laughter, the judgment, the feeling of being something less than everyone else. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a notification that made her blood run cold. Preston had posted the video. She watched with growing horror as the clip played. There she was, small and vulnerable, saying those words that had seemed so innocent when they left her mouth. "My dad is a biker." And then the explosion of laughter, the cruel jokes, her own face turning red as a tomato. The caption read, "When your dad's a tough guy on training wheels." Hadley watched the likes and comments roll in. Already over 100 views, already sharing, already spreading through the school like wildfire. She stayed in that bathroom stall until the next bell rang, and then the one after that. She could not face them. Not yet. Not with the video playing on a loop in her mind, not with the sound of their laughter echoing in her ears. But eventually she had to come out. Eventually she had to face the world. What she did not know was that the world was about to come to her. The afternoon sun beat down on the parking lot as students began streaming out of the building. Hadley walked alone, her eyes fixed on the ground, her shoulders hunched against the whispers that seemed to follow her everywhere. The video had spread faster than she could have imagined. Kids she had never spoken to were pointing and laughing. Strangers were making motorcycle sounds as she passed. The humiliation was complete, in total, a blanket of shame that wrapped around her and refused to let go. She was almost to the gate when she heard it. The sound was unmistakable. A deep, thunderous rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The growl of a Harley-Davidson engine approaching like a storm on the horizon. Students stopped in their tracks. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every head turned toward the parking lot entrance. And there he was. Colt Brennan rode into view like something out of a movie. His motorcycle gleamed in the sunlight, all chrome and black leather, an American legend on two wheels. He wore his jacket, the leather worn soft from years of use, the patches and pins telling a story that most people could never understand. He was impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss, impossible to mock. The bike came to a stop near the school gates and Colt cut the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire student body had forgotten how to breathe. Colt swung his leg over the bike with easy grace. He removed his sunglasses and tucked them into his vest pocket, revealing eyes that were sharp and clear and surprisingly kind. His gaze swept across the crowd, taking in the staring faces, the dropped jaws, the phones that had suddenly stopped recording. When his eyes found Hadley, his weathered face softened into something that looked almost like a smile. "There's my girl," he said, his voice a deep rumble that matched his bike. Hadley stood frozen, her emotions a tangled mess of embarrassment and something else. Something that felt suspiciously like pride. This was her father. This massive, intimidating, undeniably impressive man was her father. She glanced around at her classmates. Preston stood near the building entrance, his phone forgotten in his hand, his face pale. Sloane had stopped mid-step, her usual confidence replaced by something that looked a lot like fear. They were not laughing now. Colt walked toward her, his boots heavy on the pavement, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. Students parted before him like water before the bow of a ship. When he reached Hadley, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. The gesture was so at odds with his appearance that it seemed to confuse everyone watching. "Ready to go, sweetheart?" Hadley nodded, not trusting her voice. She felt the eyes following them as they walked back to the motorcycle. She heard the whispers starting up, but they were different now. There was awe in those whispers. There was respect. There was the unmistakable recognition that they had all made a terrible mistake. The man they had mocked was real. He was here, and he was nothing like what they had imagined. Colt handed her a helmet, the same one she had worn 100 times before. She climbed onto the back of the bike and wrapped her arms around her father's broad back. The engine roared to life and they pulled away from the school. Hadley did not look back. She did not need to. She could feel the weight of every stare, could sense the shift in perception that had just occurred. They had laughed at her father. They would not laugh again. The bike did not head straight home. Hadley noticed immediately when Colt turned left instead of right, taking them toward the outskirts of town. She did not ask where they were going. After 15 years, she had learned that her father always had a reason for the things he did. The road wound through rolling hills dotted with farms and old stone walls. The wind whipped past them, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and distant rain. Hadley pressed her cheek against her father's back and let the rhythm of the ride wash away some of the pain of the day. 20 minutes later, they pulled through the wrought iron gates of Riverside Cemetery. Hadley's breath caught in her throat. She knew this place. She had been here many times before, standing in front of a marble headstone that bore her mother's name. Colt parked the bike near the old oak tree that stood sentinel over the oldest section of the cemetery. He helped Hadley off and removed his helmet, running a hand through his graying hair. "I need to visit your mama," he said softly, "and there's someone I want you to meet." They walked together along the gravel path past rows of headstones that marked the final resting places of generations of Ridgemont residents. The afternoon light was golden, now casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed grass. Laurel Brennan's grave was on a small rise overlooking a pond where ducks glided in lazy circles. The headstone was simple but elegant white marble with her name and dates carved in clean letters. "Beloved wife and mother," it read, "a light that still shines." Colt knelt and placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the stone. He stayed there for a moment, his head bowed, his lips moving in silent words that were not meant for anyone else to hear. Hadley stood beside him, her hand resting on the cold marble. She barely remembered her mother, just fragments and impressions. A gentle voice singing lullabies. The smell of lavender and vanilla. Warm arms holding her close. She had been 5 years old when Laurel died. Cancer. Quick and cruel, stealing her mother away before Hadley had a chance to really know her. Sometimes she wondered what her life would have been like if her mother had lived. Would things be different? Would she feel less ashamed of who her father was? Would she understand him better? But those were questions without answers, and Hadley had learned long ago that there was no point in dwelling on might-have-beens. Colt stood up, his joints creaking slightly, and placed his hand on Hadley's shoulder. "There's someone else," he said, nodding toward another grave nearby. They walked a few yards to the right where a newer headstone stood. This one was darker, made of polished granite, and the grass around it was still fresh and green. The name engraved on its face was Sergeant Bryce Keller, and beneath it were the words, "Beloved father brave, soldier gone too soon." Hadley did not recognize the name, but before she could ask, she noticed the figure standing on the other side of the grave. It was a girl about her own age, maybe a year younger. She had reddish-brown hair that fell past her shoulders and eyes that were red from crying. She was thin, almost fragile, and she clutched a single white rose in her trembling hands. Colt approached the girl slowly, making no sound on the soft grass. "Piper," he said gently. The girl looked up, and her face crumpled. She dropped the rose and ran to Colt, throwing her arms around him and burying her face in his chest. He held her one massive hand, cradling the back of her head, letting her cry without saying a word. Hadley watched, confused and curious. Who was this girl? How did her father know her, and why was he holding her like she was something precious that might break? After a few minutes, the girl's sobs subsided. She pulled back and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, sniffling. "Sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to fall apart." "You never have to apologize for missing your daddy," Colt said. "That's the most natural thing in the world." He turned to Hadley, keeping one arm around the other girl's shoulders. "Hadley, this is Piper. Piper, this is my daughter." Piper managed a watery smile. "Hi." "Hi," Hadley replied, still trying to piece together what was happening. Colt took a deep breath, and Hadley recognized the look on his face. It was the same look he got when he was about to tell her something important. something that would change things. Piper's daddy was Sergeant Bryce Keller, Colt explained. He served 2 tours in Afghanistan. When he came back, he was hurting in ways that didn't show on the outside. He struggled with things that most people can't understand. Hadley glanced at the headstone, at the fresh grass, at the white rose lying on the ground. The dates told her that Bryce Keller had died only 3 months ago. I met Bryce at the VA hospital about 2 years ago, Cole continued. He was in a dark place, real dark. But we talked and we kept talking. I visited him every day, sometimes twice a day. We became brothers in a way. The kind of brothers you choose, not the kind you're born with. Piper's eyes were fixed on the ground, her shoulders shaking slightly. Before Bryce passed, he asked me for a promise. Colt's voice grew thick with emotion. He asked me to take care of his little girl, to make sure she had a home, a family, people who would love her no matter what. He looked at Hadley, his eyes searching her face. I made that promise, Hadley, and I intend to keep it. Hadley felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. She looked at Piper, at this stranger who was now apparently going to be part of her life, part of her family. I know this is sudden, Colt said. I should have told you sooner. I should have prepared you. But I wanted you to meet Piper here in this place where we remember the people we've lost. I wanted you to understand that family isn't just about blood. It's about the promises we make and the love we choose to give. Hadley did not know what to say. 100 thoughts raced through her mind, but none of them seemed right. Piper looked up at her eyes still glistening with tears. I know this is weird, she said quietly. You don't have to like me or anything. I don't have anywhere else to go. Something shifted in Hadley's chest. She thought about her own mother buried just a few yards away. She thought about what it would feel like to lose her father, to be completely alone in the world at 14 years old. She took a step forward and did something that surprised even herself. She hugged Piper. It was awkward at first, two strangers trying to find comfort in each other's arms. But after a moment, Piper hugged her back, and Hadley felt the younger girl's body shake with fresh sobs. It's okay, Hadley whispered, the words coming from somewhere deep inside her. You're not alone anymore. Over Piper's shoulder, she saw her father watching them. There were tears on his weathered cheeks, but he was smiling. The sun had set by the time they finally made it home. Colt's house was a modest 2-story on a quiet street at the edge of town. It was not fancy, but it was warm and lived in, filled with the evidence of their life together. Family photos on the walls. Hadley's artwork from elementary school still stuck to the refrigerator. Her mother's favorite blanket draped over the back of the couch. Piper looked around with wide eyes, taking in every detail as if she was trying to memorize it all. You'll be staying in the guest room for now, Colt said, leading her upstairs. It's small, but it's clean. We can decorate it however you want. Hadley followed behind them, still processing everything that had happened. In the span of a single day, she had been humiliated at school, rescued by her father in the most dramatic way possible, and gained a sister she never knew she wanted. It was a lot to take in. After Piper was settled in her room, Colt called Hadley down to the kitchen. He had already started making dinner, moving around the space with the ease of someone who had been cooking for himself for a long time. Sit down, he said, nodding toward the kitchen table. We need to talk. Hadley sat, her hands folded in her lap. She watched her father as he chopped vegetables, his movements precise and practiced. I know you have questions, he said without looking up. About today, about Piper, about everything. Yeah, Hadley admitted. A few. Colt set down the knife and wiped his hands on a dish towel. He turned to face her, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. What do you want to know? Hadley thought for a moment. There were so many things she wanted to ask, so many gaps in her understanding of who her father really was. But one question rose above all the others. Tell me about the Hells Angels, she said. Tell me about who you were before. Colt was silent for a long moment. His eyes grew distant, looking at something that existed only in memory. I was 17 when I joined, he finally said. My old man was a drunk who couldn't hold a job. My mama was sick, couldn't hardly get out of bed most days. I was angry at the world, angry at everything and everyone. In the club, they saw that anger. They knew how to use it. He moved to the table and sat down across from Hadley. They gave me what I thought I needed. A family, brotherhood, purpose. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere, like I mattered. His voice grew heavier. but that belonging came with a price. A price I didn't understand until it was almost too late. The things they asked me to do, the person they wanted me to become. It wasn't who I was, but I was too deep in to see it. He reached across the table and took Hadley's hand. I did things I'm not proud of, sweetheart. Things that keep me up at night, even now, 17 years later. I hurt people who didn't deserve it. I made enemies where I could have made friends. I let the anger that had been burning inside me since I was a kid turn me into someone I barely recognize when I look back. Hadley squeezed his hand. But you changed. I changed because of your mother. His eyes glistened with unshed tears. I was 28 years old when I got shot, dying on a hospital gurney, more blood on the outside than the inside. And your mama, she was the one who kept me alive. Not just with medicine, but with her words. She looked at me and she said, "You're going to live, but you have to change." He smiled a sad, beautiful smile. I married her 6 months later. Had you a year after that. And from the moment I held you in my arms, I knew I could never go back to who I was. I had to be better. For you, for her, for myself. Hadley felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. I wish I could remember her better. She's in you, Colt said. In your eyes, in your smile, in the way you see the good in people, even when they don't deserve it. She's always with us, sweetheart. Always. They sat in silence for a while, father and daughter holding on to each other in the fading light. Later that evening, after dinner had been eaten and dishes washed, after Piper had been tucked into her new bed in the guest room, Hadley sat on the porch and watched the stars come out one by one. The events of the day played through her mind like a movie. The classroom, the laughter, her father on his motorcycle silencing everyone with his mere presence. The cemetery, Piper. The story of who Colt Brennan used to be and who he had chosen to become. She was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong to be so ashamed. Maybe the thing that made her different was actually the thing that made her special. Her father's past was dark, yes, but his present was full of light. And wasn't that what mattered? She was so lost in thought that she almost did not hear the motorcycles. The sound started faint, a distant rumble that could have been thunder. But it grew louder, closer, until there was no mistaking it for anything else. Multiple engines, multiple bikes heading straight for their house. Hadley stood up, her heart suddenly racing. 3 motorcycles appeared at the end of the street, their headlights cutting through the darkness like angry eyes. They pulled up in front of the house and cut their engines, leaving an ominous silence in their wake. The lead rider dismounted first. He was tall, almost as tall as Colt, but thinner, more weathered. His face was lined with hard living, and his eyes held a coldness that made Hadley's skin crawl. His leather vest bore patches that she recognized, patches that matched the ones in those old photographs she had found years ago. 2 other men flanked him, both younger, both radiating the kind of menace that came from years of violence. The front door opened behind Hadley, and Colt stepped out onto the porch. His face was calm, but his body was tense, coiled like a spring. "Wade," he said, "just the name, nothing more." The lead rider smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Colt," he replied, "been a long time." Wade walked slowly up the path, his boots crunching on the gravel. His companions stayed by their bikes, arms crossed, watching. "Heard you were doing real good for yourself these days," Wade said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Charity rides, helping veterans, playing the good citizen." He spat on the ground. "Makes me sick." Colt stepped forward, positioning himself between Wade and Hadley. "What do you want?" Wade reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. He held it up, letting it catch the porch light. "Just wanted to make sure your little girl knows who her daddy really is." He tossed the envelope at Colt's feet. Photographs spilled out onto the wooden planks. Even in the dim light, Hadley could see what they showed. Her father, younger but unmistakable, his face twisted with rage. His fists connecting with another man's face, the victim's features barely recognizable through the blood. More pictures, more violence, more evidence of a past that Colt had tried so hard to leave behind. "Does she know about this?" Wade's voice was triumphant. "Does she know what her daddy used to do for fun?" Hadley felt her stomach turn. She looked at the photographs, at the man in them, who looked nothing like the father she knew. The man in those pictures was a monster, a stranger. Colt's jaw tightened, but he did not respond to Wade's taunts. He stood his ground, solid and unmoving. "You can't erase who you are, Colt," Wade continued, All this playing, pretend, and all this charity work, it doesn't change what you did, what we did together. He took a step closer, his face inches from Colt's. You left us, brother. You turned your back on everything we built. And for what, a woman who's dead and a kid who's probably ashamed to call you daddy. Hadley flinched at the words. They hit too close to home, too close to the secret shame she had carried for so long. Colt's hands clenched at his sides, but his voice remained steady. You need to leave now, Wade. Wade laughed a harsh, bitter sound. I'll leave when I'm good and ready. He turned to look directly at Hadley, his cold eyes meeting hers. Just wanted to make sure the princess here knows she's living with a monster. He turned and walked back to his motorcycle, his companions following without a word. The engines roared to life, shattering the quiet of the night. Before he pulled away, Wade looked back one more time. This isn't over, Colt. Not by a long shot. Then they were gone, the sound of their bikes fading into the distance until it was swallowed by the silence. Hadley stood frozen on the porch, staring at the photographs scattered at her father's feet. She wanted to look away, but she could not. The images burned themselves into her memory, impossible to unsee. Colt knelt down slowly and began gathering the pictures. His movements were careful, almost gentle, like he was handling something fragile. Hadley, he said without looking up, I can explain. But Hadley was already backing toward the door. Her mind was racing, spinning with everything she had seen and heard. The classroom, the cemetery, the story her father had told her. And now this evidence of who he really was. Hadley, please. She turned and ran inside up the stairs to her room. She slammed the door behind her and threw herself onto the bed, burying her face in her pillow. Through the wall, she could hear Piper crying in the next room. The younger girl must have heard everything, must have witnessed the whole ugly confrontation. Hadley thought about going to her, about offering comfort, but she could barely hold herself together. How was she supposed to help someone else? She lay there in the darkness, listening to Piper's sobs, feeling her own tears soaking into the pillow. This morning she had been embarrassed by her father. Tonight she did not know what she felt. The man in those photographs, the monster with the bloody fists, that was not the father who made her pancakes on Sunday mornings. That was not the father who visited veterans in the hospital, who had taken in a grieving orphan girl, who had held her hand and told her stories about change and redemption. But it was the same man, the same person. Past and present, monster and hero, all wrapped up in one complicated package. Hadley pressed her face deeper into the pillow and let herself cry. Outside her window, the night was quiet again, but somewhere in the distance, she could still hear the faint echo of motorcycle engines. And she knew that Wade had told the truth about one thing. This was not over. The week that followed was the longest of Hadley's life. She moved through the house like a ghost, avoiding her father whenever possible. At breakfast, she kept her eyes on her plate. At dinner, she answered his questions with single words. Yes, no, fine. The photographs haunted her, appearing every time she closed her eyes. Her father's face twisted with rage, the blood on his knuckles, the violence frozen in time. Colt tried to reach her. He knocked on her door every night, asking if they could talk. He left notes on her pillow, small messages that said things like, I love you, and please let me explain. But Hadley was not ready to listen. She was not sure she would ever be ready. At school, things were even worse. The video had taken on a life of its own. Someone had added music to it, turning her humiliation into entertainment. Memes appeared, spreading through group chats and social media feeds like a virus. Hadley's face became a punchline, her words a joke that everyone seemed to be in on except her. She ate lunch alone in the library, hiding behind stacks of books where no one would think to look. She walked the long way between classes, timing her movements to avoid the crowds. She became an expert at invisibility, shrinking herself down until she was almost nothing at all. But there was one person who refused to let her disappear. Brinley Cooper had been Hadley's best friend since the 3rd grade. They had bonded over a shared love of horses and a mutual hatred of math homework. Through all the years of middle school drama and high school politics, Brinley had been the one constant in Hadley's life. She found Hadley in the library on the 4th day, sitting alone at a table in the back corner with an untouched sandwich in front of her. This is pathetic, Brinley said, sliding into the chair across from her. You know that, right? Hadley looked up, her eyes red from lack of sleep. Thanks for the support. I'm serious. Brinley leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. You're letting them win. Preston and Sloan and all those other idiots. You're giving them exactly what they want. What am I supposed to do? Hadley's voice cracked. You saw the pictures, Bryn. Everyone saw them. My dad is a monster. Brinley was quiet for a moment. She reached across the table and took Hadley's hand. I saw some old photographs, she said carefully. I don't know the story behind them, neither do you. Neither does anyone else at this school. The story is pretty obvious. Is it? Brinley squeezed her hand. Your dad has been nothing but good to you for 15 years. He raised you alone after your mom died. He works hard, he takes care of you. He took in that girl Piper without even thinking twice. Does that sound like a monster to you? Hadley did not answer. You need to hear his side of the story, Brinley continued. You owe him that much. You owe yourself that much. Don't let one photograph taken out of context by some jerk from his past define everything you know about your father. The words hung in the air between them. Hadley wanted to argue, wanted to explain why it was not that simple. But deep down, she knew Brinley was right. She just was not ready to admit it yet. That night, Hadley lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, but she could hear movement from the room next door. Piper had been just as withdrawn as she was, spending most of her time alone, barely speaking to anyone. A soft knock came at the connecting door between their rooms. Hadley hesitated, then said, "Come in." The door opened slowly and Piper slipped through. She was wearing oversized pajamas that had belonged to Hadley when she was younger, her reddish-brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked small and lost like a child half her age. "Can I sit with you?" she asked quietly. Hadley nodded and scooted over to make room on the bed. Piper climbed up and sat cross-legged, her hands folded in her lap. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable, just heavy with things that needed to be said. Finally, Piper broke it. "I know what you're going through," she said. "The confusion, the anger, feeling like everything you believed was a lie." Hadley turned to look at her. "How could you possibly know?" "Because I felt the same way about my dad." The words were unexpected. Hadley had assumed that Piper's relationship with her father had been perfect, that his death had shattered an idyllic life. But the pain in Piper's eyes told a different story. "My dad came back from Afghanistan different." Piper continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "He had nightmares every night. He would wake up screaming, thinking he was still over there. Sometimes he didn't recognize me. Sometimes he looked at me like I was a stranger." She pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself smaller. "He started drinking to make the memories stop. And when he drank, he got angry. He never hurt me, not physically, but he said things, terrible things, things that made me wonder if he even loved me anymore." Hadley felt her heart clench. She had never imagined that Piper's life had been anything but simple. "I was so angry at him," Piper admitted. "I thought he was selfish. I thought he was weak. I didn't understand why he couldn't just be normal, why he couldn't just be my dad again." "What changed?" Piper looked up, her eyes glistening with tears. "Colt." The name hung in the air like a prayer. "My dad was at his lowest point," Piper said. "He had pushed everyone away, his friends, his family, even me. He was living in a VA hospital, and nobody came to visit him. Nobody except Colt." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Every single day for 2 years, Colt showed up. He sat with my dad, talked to him, listened to his stories. He didn't judge him for the drinking or the anger. He just kept showing up day after day, week after week. Hadley tried to imagine her father doing this, driving to the VA hospital every day, sitting with a broken man offering nothing but patience and presence. "My dad tried to kill himself 3 times, Piper whispered. "And all 3 times, Colt was the one who found him, who saved him, who held him until the darkness passed." The tears were flowing freely now down Piper's cheeks and onto the bedspread. "I didn't know any of this until after my dad died. The nurses told me. They said Colt was the only reason my father lasted as long as he did. That without him, my dad would have been gone years ago." Piper turned to face Hadley, directly, her young face fierce with conviction. "I don't know what your dad did in his past. I don't know what those pictures mean. But I know who he is now, and the man who sat with my dying father every day for 2 years, who promised to take care of me when no one else would, that man is not a monster. That man is a hero." Hadley could not speak. The lump in her throat was too large, the emotions too overwhelming. She reached out and pulled Piper into a hug. The younger girl clung to her, and for a long time they just held each other, two daughters bound together by the complicated men they loved. The next morning, Hadley came down to breakfast. Colt was at the stove making scrambled eggs. He looked tired, like he had not slept well in days. When he heard her footsteps, he turned around and the hope in his eyes was almost painful to see. "Morning," he said carefully. Hadley sat down at the table. "Morning." Silence stretched between them. Colt turned back to the eggs, stirring them with more attention than they required. "Dad." He froze at the word. It was the first time she had called him that in a week. "There's a charity ride this weekend," Hadley said, "for veterans. Piper told me about it." Colt set down the spatula and turned to face her. "That's right, we do it every year." "I want to come." The words surprised both of them. Hadley had not planned to say them, but once they were out, she knew they were true. She needed to see for herself. She needed to understand who her father really was now, not just who he had been. Colt's face softened. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He nodded slowly and something like relief washed over his features. Okay, sweetheart. I'd like that. I'd like that a lot." Saturday morning dawned clear and bright. The sky was that perfect shade of blue that only appeared in autumn, and the air was crisp with the promise of changing seasons. Hadley stood in the driveway watching as her father went through his pre-ride routine. He checked the tires, the brakes, the oil levels moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Piper emerged from the house wearing a leather jacket that was slightly too big for her. She looked nervous but excited, bouncing on the balls of her feet. "Ready?" Colt asked. Both girls nodded. They rode through the quiet streets of Ridgemont, the morning sun warm on their backs. Hadley held on to her father, her arms wrapped around his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath the leather. It was strange. For so many years she had been embarrassed by this. By the motorcycle, by the tattoos, by everything her father represented. But now, with her cheek pressed against his back and the wind in her hair, she felt something different. Something that might have been peace. Pete's Diner sat at the edge of town, a chrome and glass relic from the 1950s that had somehow survived into the modern age. The parking lot was already filled with motorcycles when they arrived, a sea of chrome and leather that stretched across the asphalt. Hadley climbed off the bike and looked around with wide eyes. There had to be at least 50 motorcycles here, maybe more. And the men and women who owned them were not what she had expected. Yes, there were tattoos and leather vests and weathered faces that spoke of hard living, but there were also smiles and laughter and handshakes that went on a beat too long, the way old friends greet each other after too much time apart. A tall man with gray hair and kind eyes approached them first. He clapped Colt on the shoulder and then turned to Hadley. "You must be Hadley," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Mike. I've heard a lot about you." Hadley shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the warmth in his eyes. "Nice to meet you." "Your dad talks about you all the time," Mike continued. "Can't shut him up, actually. You'd think you hung the moon." Hadley glanced at her father, who had the decency to look slightly embarrassed. "Mike runs a shelter for homeless veterans over in Springfield," Colt explained. "He's been doing it for 15 years now." "Couldn't have done it without your dad's help," Mike said. "He's been our biggest supporter since day one, Shran. Fundraising, volunteering, whatever we need. He's always there." More introductions followed. There was Big Tom, a mountain of a man whose neck was covered in tattoos but whose voice was surprisingly gentle. He worked as a counselor for troubled teenagers, using his own past to help kids avoid the mistakes he had made. There was Martha, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a Harley that looked older than Hadley. She had been a nurse in the Gulf War and now devoted her time to helping veterans access the benefits they deserved. There was Frank, who had lost both legs in Iraq and now worked with other amputees to help them adjust to life after injury. He wheeled his chair between the motorcycles with the ease of long practice, stopping to chat with everyone he passed. One by one, they all told her the same thing. "Your father is a good man. Your father helped me when no one else would. Your father changed my life." Hadley listened to their stories, and with each one, the photographs in her mind began to fade. Not disappear entirely, but lose their power. These people had known her father for years. They had seen him at his best and perhaps at his worst. And they had chosen to stand beside him. That had to mean something. As the sun climbed higher, and the parking lot filled with more bikes, Hadley began to see a pattern. These were not the lawless criminals she had imagined. These were people who had found their way back from the edge, who had taken the skills and loyalty they had learned in harder times and redirected them towards something good. There was Danny, a former drug dealer who now ran a halfway house for recovering addicts. He had been clean for 12 years, and he credited Colt with helping him find the strength to stay sober. There was Rosa, a woman with a sleeve of tattoos and a heart of gold, who organized Christmas toy drives for children in foster care. She hugged Hadley like they had known each other for years. "Your daddy talks about you all the time," Rosa said, her eyes crinkling with warmth. "He's so proud of you, honey. You're the reason he gets up every morning." Hadley felt something shift inside her. All this time she had been so focused on what her father's past said about him that she had never stopped to consider what his present said about her. He had changed for her. He had built a new life for her. Everything he did, every charity ride and hospital visit and act of kindness, was rooted in the promise he had made the day she was born. She was not a burden or a secret shame. She was his reason for being better. The realization hit her like a wave washing away some of the guilt and confusion she had been carrying. She thought about all the times she had been embarrassed by him, all the times she had wished for a different father. And she felt ashamed not of him, but of herself. "You okay, sweetheart?" Colt appeared at her side, his forehead creased with concern. Hadley nodded, blinking back tears. "Yeah, Dad, I'm okay." He studied her face for a moment, then pulled her into a gentle hug. She leaned into him, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and motor oil, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. As the morning wore on, Big Tom approached Hadley while she was getting a cup of coffee from the diner's counter. He was even more imposing up close, his arms as thick as tree trunks, his weathered face lined with years of hard living. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked. Hadley nodded, suddenly nervous. There was something in his eyes, a weight that suggested what he had to say was important. They walked to a quiet corner of the parking lot, away from the crowd. Big Tom leaned against a fence post and crossed his arms. "I heard about the pictures," he said, "the ones that man Wade threw at your daddy's feet." Hadley tensed. "How did you know about that?" "Word travels fast in our world." Big Tom's voice was gentle despite his intimidating appearance. "I also know what you must be thinking. What kind of man beats someone that badly? What kind of monster could do what those pictures showed?" Hadley did not answer. She did not need to. "I know what kind of man," Big Tom continued, "because I was there that night, and I know why your daddy did what he did." The words hit Hadley like a physical blow. She stared at Big Tom, her heart suddenly racing. "The man in those pictures," Big Tom said slowly, "his name was Earl Dawson. He was a member of our club back then, had a house on the edge of town where he liked to have parties. Your daddy found out what was happening at his place one night." He paused, his jaw tightening with the memory. "We heard crying coming from one of the back rooms. Thought maybe someone was hurt, so your daddy went to check. And what he found in that room was something that changed both of us forever." Hadley's throat went dry. "What did he find?" "A teenager." Big Tom's voice cracked on the word. "A 15-year-old kid trapped in a nightmare. Earl Dawson had been hurting that boy for years, in ways that no one should ever have to experience." The world seemed to tilt beneath Hadley's feet. She grabbed the fence post to steady herself. "Your daddy didn't think," Big Tom continued. "He didn't plan or calculate. He just saw that kid saw what was happening, and something inside him snapped. He pulled Earl off that boy, and he beat him. Beat him until Earl couldn't get up anymore. Beat him until the rest of us had to pull him away." Tears were streaming down Hadley's cheeks now, but she did not wipe them away. "Earl went to prison after that, spent 15 years behind bars for what he did. And that teenager, the one your daddy saved that night." Big Tom's voice broke. He looked away, blinking rapidly. "That teenager was me." The words hung in the air like a revelation. Hadley stared at him, at this massive man with the gentle eyes, and saw the ghost of the boy he had once been. "I was in foster care," Big Tom said. "Nobody cared what happened to me. Nobody even noticed I was missing. But your daddy cared. He saved my life that night. And he never told anyone what really happened in those pictures. He let people think the worst of him rather than expose what had been done to me. He finally looked at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Your daddy is not a monster, Hadley. He's the best man I've ever known, and I owe him everything. Hadley could not speak, could not move, could only stand there as the truth washed over her, rewriting everything she had believed about her father and his past. The man in those photographs was not a monster. He was a hero who had never asked for recognition. He was her father. The charity ride wound through the countryside, a procession of chrome and leather that stretched for nearly a mile. Hadley rode behind her father, her arms wrapped around him, seeing the world through new eyes. They passed farms and fields, small towns and sprawling suburbs. People lined the roads to watch them pass, waving flags and holding signs that said things like, "Thank you for your service," and "We support our veterans." Children pointed excitedly at the motorcycles, and elderly men in veteran caps stood at attention as the convoy rolled by. At each stop, people approached with donations. Cash stuffed into envelopes, checks written on the spot, promises of support and gratitude. By the time they reached the Springfield Veterans Hospital, they had raised more money than Hadley could have imagined. The hospital was a sprawling complex of brick buildings and manicured lawns. Patients in wheelchairs sat outside enjoying the autumn sunshine. Nurses moved between them, checking vitals and offering words of encouragement. Colt led the way through the front doors, and Hadley watched as the atmosphere changed. The veterans who had seemed so lost, so disconnected, suddenly came alive. They called out her father's name, reaching for his hand, pulling him into hugs that spoke of deep and lasting friendship. "Colt, you old duh," one man shouted from his wheelchair. "Thought you'd forgotten about us." "Never, Frank," Colt replied, kneeling down to embrace him. "How's the new prosthetic treating you?" "Better than the VA's finest." Frank laughed. "Thanks to you and the boys." They moved through the hospital like a wave of light, spreading warmth wherever they went. Hadley and Piper helped distribute care packages filled with necessities and comfort items. Toiletries, warm socks, books, playing cards, small things that meant everything to men and women who had given so much for their country. In one room, they met a young man named Tommy. He could not have been more than 25, with a prosthetic leg and eyes that had seen too much. He sat up straighter when Colt entered, a smile breaking across his scarred face. "Mr. Brennan," he said, "I was hoping you'd come by." "Wouldn't miss it," Colt replied, pulling up a chair. "How's the therapy going?" "Walking without a cane now," Tommy said proudly. "Doc says I might even be able to run someday. All thanks to that new equipment you guys funded." Colt waved away the gratitude. "That money came from the community, not from me." "But you organized it. You made it happen." Tommy turned to Hadley, his eyes bright with emotion. "Your dad saved my life, you know, not just with the equipment, but by showing me that people still cared. When I came back from overseas, I thought everyone had forgotten about us. Your dad proved me wrong." Hadley looked at her father, at the man she had been so ashamed of, and felt something shift inside her chest. Pride. Pure, overwhelming pride. She watched as Colt moved from bed to bed, from wheelchair to wheelchair, giving each person the gift of his full attention. He remembered names, birthdays, the names of their children and grandchildren. He asked about medical procedures and celebrated small victories like they were major triumphs. And with each interaction, Hadley saw the impact he had on these veterans. They were not just patients to him. They were warriors, heroes, brothers and sisters in arms. And he treated them with the respect and dignity they deserved. In another room, an elderly woman sat alone by a window staring out at the autumn leaves. Her husband had been a veteran, Colt explained quietly. He had passed away 2 years ago, but she still came to the hospital every week, volunteering in the gift shop, spending time with the current patients. "Mrs. Henderson," Colt said, approaching her chair, "I'd like you to meet my daughter, Hadley." The woman turned, her face lighting up with a smile that transformed her weathered features. "Oh, Colt, I've heard so much about this one." She reached out and took Hadley's hand in both of hers. "You have your father's eyes, dear. That same kindness." Hadley felt tears threatening to spill. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson." "Your father is a good man," the elderly woman continued. "When my Harold was sick, when the doctors said there was nothing more they could do, Colt was here every day, sitting with Harold, talking about motorcycles and baseball and all the things that made my husband feel alive." Her voice trembled. "He gave Harold his dignity back, and he gave me the gift of seeing my husband smile again, even at the end." Colt squeezed Mrs. Henderson's shoulder gently. Harold was a hero. He earned every moment of peace we could give him. They spent 3 hours at the hospital talking with veterans, listening to their stories, offering what comfort they could. By the time they left, Hadley's face hurt from smiling, and her heart felt fuller than it had in years. The ride home was quiet, the three of them lost in their own thoughts. The sun was setting by the time they pulled into the driveway, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Colt cut the engine and turned to look at Hadley. "Thank you for coming," he said simply. Hadley climbed off the bike and removed her helmet. She looked at her father, at the man who had spent years trying to atone for his past, who had devoted his life to helping others, who had saved a teenager from horror and never spoken of it. "I'm sorry," she said, "for pulling away, for believing the worst, for being so afraid of what other people thought." Colt's eyes glistened. "You had every right to be confused. Those pictures, they were real. What I did was real. I can't change my past, sweetheart. I can only try to be better today." Hadley stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her father. He held her tight, his strong arms a shelter from the storm. "I'm proud of you," she whispered against his chest. "I should have said it a long time ago, but I'm proud to be your daughter." Colt's body shook with silent sobs. He buried his face in her hair and held her like he would never let go. And in that moment, standing in the driveway with the sunset blazing behind them, Hadley finally understood what her father had been trying to teach her all along. The past does not define us. What matters is who we choose to be today. But the peace was not destined to last. 3 days later, Hadley came home from school to find her father sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. His face was pale and his hands were trembling slightly. "Dad, what's wrong?" He looked up at her and she saw fear in his eyes. Real fear, the kind she had never seen before. "It's Wade," he said quietly. "He's been watching you." He turned the phone so she could see the screen. There were photographs. Photographs of her walking to school. Photographs of Piper waiting at the bus stop. Photographs taken from a distance with a long lens capturing moments that should have been private. And beneath the photographs, a message. "You took everything from me. My brothers, my honor, my life. Now I'm going to take everything from you." Hadley's blood ran cold. "We need to call the police." "Already did." Colt's voice was heavy with frustration. "They said there's not enough evidence. No direct threats, no physical contact. They can't do anything until he actually does something." "That's insane." "That's the law." Colt stood up and paced the kitchen. "I've known Wade for 30 years. We were brothers once, closer than blood. When I got shot, he was the one who dragged me out of that bar. He took a bullet himself, saving my life." He stopped by the window, staring out at the darkening street. "When I left the club, when I chose Laurel and a different life, Wade took it as betrayal. He couldn't understand why I would walk away from everything we had built together. He thought I was abandoning him." "Were you?" Colt turned to face her, his eyes filled with old pain. "I tried to bring him with me, offered him a job at the garage, a place to stay, a chance to start over. But Wade was too proud, too angry. He couldn't accept help from someone he saw as a traitor." He sat back down heavily. "Over the years, I watched him fall apart. His wife left him. His son wanted nothing to do with him. The club kicked him out for being too violent, even for them. And all that time he blamed me. Blamed me for everything that went wrong in his life." Hadley sat down across from her father. "What do we do now? We stay alert, we stay together, and we hope that Wade comes to his senses before anyone gets hurt." But hope was not enough. 1 week later, Piper did not come home from school. Hadley had stayed late for drama club rehearsal. She expected to find Piper in her room doing homework, but the house was empty. She checked every room, called out her name, even walked around the block looking for her. Nothing. She was about to call her father when his motorcycle roared into the driveway. Colt burst through the front door, his face ashen. "Where's Piper?" "I don't know. She wasn't here when I got home." Colt's phone rang. He answered it on the first ring, putting it on speaker. Wade's voice filled the room, thick with alcohol and something darker. "Hello, brother." Colt's hands clenched into fists. "Where is she, Wade?" "She's safe for now." A pause. "But that depends on you. What do you want?" "I want what you took from me. I want my brother back." I want you to remember who you really are. Wade's voice rose with emotion. I want you to stop pretending you're better than us. This isn't about that. This is about an innocent girl. Let her go. Come to the old warehouse on Miller Road. The one where we used to have meetings. Come alone. No police, no friends, no backup. Just you and me like the old days. Colt's jaw tightened. And if I don't, then the girl pays for your choices, just like everyone else has. The line went dead. Hadley's heart was pounding so hard she could barely think. Dad, you can't go alone. It's a trap. I know it's a trap. Colt was already moving, grabbing his jacket, checking his phone. But I don't have a choice. That's Piper in there. I promised her father I would keep her safe. Then let me come with you. Absolutely not. Dad, please, I can't just sit here and wait. Colt stopped and turned to face her. His eyes were fierce, but beneath the fierceness was a fear she had never seen before. You are the most important sphinx in my front, he said. You and Piper. I will not put you in danger. Not for anything. He pulled her into a brief, tight hug. Stay here. Lock the doors. Call the police and tell them where I've gone. He pulled back and held her face in his hands. I love you, sweetheart. Never forget that. And then he was gone, the roar of his motorcycle fading into the night. Hadley stood in the empty house, her mind racing. She should do what her father said. She should stay here, stay safe, let the adults handle it. But Piper was out there. Piper, who had lost her father, who had no one else in the world, who had become the sister Hadley never knew she needed. She could not just sit here and wait. Hadley grabbed her phone and sent a quick text to Brinley, giving her the address of the warehouse and telling her to call 911 if she did not hear from Hadley in an hour. Then she grabbed her bike from the garage and rode out into the darkness. The old warehouse on Miller Road was a relic from another era, a hulking structure of rusted metal and broken windows. It had been abandoned for decades, home to nothing but rats and memories. Hadley approached from the back, staying in the shadows, her heart pounding in her ears. She could see her father's motorcycle parked near the front entrance, but there was no sign of him. She crept closer, ducking behind old machinery and piles of debris. Through a gap in the wall, she could see inside. Wade stood in the center of the warehouse, illuminated by the harsh light of a single bulb. He looked older than she remembered, his face lined with bitterness and defeat. A gun hung loosely in his hand. Piper was tied to a chair nearby, her mouth covered with tape, her eyes wide with terror. And there was her father standing 10 feet from Wade, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Let her go, Wade, Colt was saying. She has nothing to do with this. This is between you and me. Everything is between you and me, Wade replied, his voice slurring slightly. That's the problem. You made it that way when you walked out on us. I didn't walk out on you. I walked away from a life that was killing me. You left me behind. Wade's voice cracked with emotion. You were my brother, my only family, and you left me to rot while you played house with your nurse and your perfect little girl. Colt took a step forward. I tried to help you, Wade, more times than I can count. I didn't want your help. Wade raised the gun, pointing it at Colt's chest. I wanted my brother back. Hadley's breath caught in her throat. She had to do something. She could not just stand here and watch. But what could she possibly do against a man with a gun? Then she remembered the photograph her father kept in his wallet, the one Piper had told her about, the one that showed Colt and Wade as young men, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera like they had the whole world ahead of them. She had taken it from his wallet that morning on an impulse she did not understand. It was in her pocket right now. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was the worst idea she had ever had, but it was all she had. Hadley took a deep breath and stepped out of the shadows. The warehouse fell silent as Hadley stepped into the light. Wade spun around, the gun now aimed at her chest. His eyes were wild, bloodshot from alcohol and sleepless nights. For a moment, he looked like a cornered animal, dangerous and unpredictable. Hadley, no! Colt shouted, his voice cracking with fear. But Hadley kept walking. One step, then another. Her legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand, but she forced herself to keep moving forward. Another hostage. Wade said, a twisted smile spreading across his face. This just keeps getting better. I'm not a hostage. Hadley's voice trembled, but she did not stop. I'm here because I need to show you something. Wade laughed a harsh, bitter sound. What could you possibly show me that would matter? Hadley reached into her pocket with trembling fingers. The photograph was there, warm from being pressed against her body. She pulled it out slowly, holding it up so Wade could see. This, she said, the photograph was old, its edges worn soft from years of handling. The colors had faded slightly, giving it the quality of a memory of something precious that had been touched 1,000 times. Two young men stood side by side, their arms draped over each other's shoulders. They were grinning at the camera with the reckless joy of youth, of brotherhood, of a bond that seemed unbreakable. Wade's face changed. The wildness in his eyes flickered, replaced by something else. Something that looked almost like pain. Where did you get that? His voice was barely a whisper. My father keeps it in his wallet, Hadley said. He's carried it every day for 20 years. Every single day, Wade. Through everything. Through leaving the club, through marrying my mother, through raising me alone after she died. He never stopped carrying this picture. He never stopped carrying you. Wade's hand began to shake. The gun wavered in his grip, no longer pointed at anyone in particular. You're lying. I'm not. Hadley took another step closer. She was only a few feet from him now, close enough to see the tears forming in his eyes. You think my father abandoned you. You think he forgot about you. But look at this picture. Look at how he's holding on to it. He never let you go, Wade, not in his heart. Colt had moved closer too, his eyes fixed on his old friend. She's telling the truth, Wade. I've carried that picture since the day it was taken. You were my brother, you still are. Then why, Wade's voice broke. Why did you leave? Why did you get to have everything while I got nothing? I didn't leave you, I left the life, and I begged you to come with me. Colt's voice was thick with emotion. How many times, Wade? How many times did I offer you a way out? A job at the garage, a room in my house, a chance to start over. I didn't want your charity. It wasn't charity, it was love. Colt's eyes were glistening now. You saved my life that night in the bar. You took a bullet for me. Do you think I could ever forget that? Do you think I could ever stop caring about the man who gave me a second chance? Wade stood frozen, the gun hanging limply at his side. His face was a battlefield of emotions, anger and grief and longing, all fighting for dominance. Hadley took one more step. She was directly in front of him now, close enough to touch. Piper's father was a veteran, she said softly. He came back from the war, broken. Everyone gave up on him. Everyone except my dad. For 2 years, my father visited him every single day. He sat with him, he listened to him. He refused to let him face the darkness alone. She reached out and gently took the gun from Wade's unresisting hand. He let her take it, his eyes fixed on the photograph. That's who my father is now, Hadley continued. A man who doesn't give up on people. A man who believes that everyone deserves a second chance. A man who would do anything for the people he loves. She pressed the photograph into Wade's trembling hands. He never stopped believing in you, Wade. The question is, are you brave enough to believe in yourself? The gun clattered to the concrete floor. The sound echoed through the empty warehouse like a gunshot, making everyone flinch. And then Wade collapsed. His knees hit the ground first, followed by his hands. His shoulders shook with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him, from a place that had been locked away for decades. The photograph fluttered to the floor beside him, those two young men still smiling up at the rusted rafters. I'm sorry, Wade gasped between sobs. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know how to stop being angry. Colt moved then, crossing the distance between them in 3 long strides. He dropped to his knees beside his old friend and pulled him into an embrace. Two men who had once been brothers, separated by years of pain and misunderstanding, holding on to each other in the dim light of an abandoned warehouse. It's okay, Colt murmured. I've got you. I've got you, brother. Hadley rushed to Piper, pulling the tape from her mouth and working at the ropes that bound her to the chair. Piper was crying too, tears of relief streaming down her face. You came, Piper whispered. You actually came for me. Of course I did. Hadley pulled the last rope free and helped Piper to her feet. You're my sister. The word hung in the air between them, new and strange and absolutely right. Piper threw her arms around Hadley, holding on like she would never let go. Behind them, sirens began to wail in the distance. Red and blue lights appeared at the warehouse entrance, painting the walls with color. Car doors slammed and voices shouted commands. The police had arrived. Colt helped Wade to his feet, keeping one arm around his shoulders. Wade looked smaller, somehow diminished by the weight of his confession. But there was something different in his eyes now. Something that almost looked like hope. "Stay behind me," Colt said quietly. "Let me handle this." Two officers entered the warehouse with their weapons drawn. They took in the scene quickly, their eyes moving from the discarded gun on the floor to the two girls embracing to the two men standing together. "Everyone put your hands where we can see them," one officer commanded. Colt raised his hand slowly. "Officers, my name is Colt Brennan. This is my friend Wade. He needs medical help, not handcuffs." The officer's eyes narrowed. "We received a report of a kidnapping." "There was a misunderstanding." Colt's voice was calm but firm. "Wade is struggling with addiction and mental health issues. He made a mistake tonight, but no one was hurt. What he needs is treatment, not prison." "That's not how this works, sir." "Then let me explain how it should work." Colt took a step forward, putting himself between Wade and the officers. "This man saved my life 20 years ago. He took a bullet that was meant for me. He's a veteran of a different kind of war, a war that most people don't even know is being fought. And right now, he's asking for help." The officer hesitated. His partner had lowered her weapon slightly, her face showing uncertainty. "I'll take full responsibility for him," Colt continued. "I'll get him into a treatment program tonight. I'll make sure he gets the help he needs. Just give him a chance. Give him one chance to prove he can change." A long moment passed. The sirens outside had stopped, but the lights continued to flash, casting strange shadows across the warehouse floor. Finally, the lead officer sighed and holstered his weapon. "I know who you are, Mr. Brennan," he said. "I know about the charity rides, the work you do with veterans. My own father benefited from one of your programs after he came back from Vietnam." He looked at Wade, who stood trembling beside Colt, his face streaked with tears. "I'll need statements from everyone. And if this man doesn't get into treatment by morning, I'll be back with a warrant." "He will," Colt said. "I promise you that." The officer nodded slowly. "Then we'll call this a mental health crisis rather than a kidnapping. But this is a one-time deal, Mr. Brennan. Don't make me regret it." "You won't." The next few hours passed in a blur of statements and phone calls and paperwork. Hadley sat with Piper in the back of an ambulance while a paramedic checked them over. Neither of them was hurt, at least not physically, but the emotional wounds would take longer to heal. Through the open doors of the ambulance, Hadley watched her father. He stood with Wade near one of the police cars talking quietly. At one point, Wade broke down again, and Colt held him the same way he had held Hadley so many times before, with patience, with love, with the unshakable belief that everyone deserved a second chance. Brinley arrived at some point, having tracked down the location from her texts. She pushed past the police tape and ran straight to Hadley, pulling her into a fierce hug. "Don't you ever do something that stupid again," Brinley said, her voice muffled against Hadley's shoulder. "I aged 10 years tonight." "I'm sorry," Hadley replied, "but I had to." Brinley pulled back and looked at her friend. "Yeah," she said softly, "I know you did." By the time they finally made it home, the first light of dawn was breaking over the mountains. Hadley had never been so exhausted in her life, but she could not sleep. Too much had happened. Too much had changed. She sat on the front porch wrapped in a blanket, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The door opened behind her, and Colt came out with 2 cups of coffee. He sat down beside her and handed her a cup. They sat in silence for a while, watching the world wake up. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," Colt finally said, "walking into that warehouse, talking to Wade like that. You could have been killed." "I know." Hadley took a sip of her coffee. "But I kept thinking about what you always say, that people can change, that everyone deserves a chance to be better. If that's true for you and Wade, then maybe it's true for everyone." Colt was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "Your mother would be so proud of you." Hadley felt tears prick at her eyes. "You think so? I know so." Colt put his arm around her and pulled her close. "She always believed in the goodness of people. She saw it in me when no one else could. And you have that same gift, sweetheart. that same ability to see the light in the darkness. And they sat together as the sun rose higher, father and daughter holding on to each other in the fragile hope that the worst was behind them. 3 months passed. Spring arrived in Ridgemont with a burst of color and warmth. The trees along Main Street exploded with blossoms, and the air carried the sweet scent of new beginnings. It was the kind of season that made people believe in second chances, in fresh starts, and the possibility of change. Wade had been in treatment for 90 days. Colt visited him every week, making the 2-hour drive to the rehabilitation center without complaint. The reports were encouraging. Wade was sober for the first time in years. He was attending group therapy, working through decades of anger and grief. He was starting to resemble the man he had been before bitterness consumed him. At school, things had shifted for Hadley. The video that Preston had posted felt like ancient history, now a relic from a different era. In its place was a new story, one that had spread through the school in whispers and rumors. People had heard about the warehouse, about Hadley walking unarmed into a dangerous situation to save her sister, about her father standing up for a man who had threatened his family. The details were exaggerated, of course, growing more dramatic with each retelling. But the core truth remained. Hadley Brennan was not someone to be mocked. She was someone to be respected. The change was gradual at first. Kids who had laughed at her started nodding hello in the hallways. Students who had avoided her began sitting near her in the cafeteria. Even Sloan Montgomery had stopped making snide comments, though Hadley suspected that had more to do with self-preservation than genuine remorse. But the real shift came on a Tuesday afternoon in late April. Mr. Crawford announced that the school would be hosting an end-of-year assembly. Students were invited to give speeches about their experiences, about the lessons they had learned, about the people who had shaped their lives. Hadley's hand went up before she could stop it. "I'd like to speak," she said. The assembly hall was packed. Every seat was filled, and students lined the walls, craning their necks to see the stage. Teachers stood at the back, arm crossed, watching with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. Hadley stood behind the podium, looking out at the sea of faces. Her heart was pounding, and her palms were slick with sweat. But she thought about her father, about Piper, about Big Tom and the veterans, and all the people who had taught her what courage really meant. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "3 months ago, most of you saw a video of me in history class. I said my dad was a biker, and everyone laughed. Some of you made memes. Some of you called me names, and for a while I let that define me." The room was silent. Not a single whisper, not a single rustle. "What you didn't know, what I didn't even fully understand myself, was who my father really is. Yes, he rides a motorcycle. Yes, he has tattoos and a leather jacket and a past that includes things he's not proud of. But that past doesn't define him. What defines him is what he's done since." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "My father has spent the last 17 years trying to make the world a little bit better. He organizes charity rides that raise thousands of dollars for veterans. He visits VA hospitals every week, sitting with men and women who served our country and came back broken. He took in a 14-year-old girl whose father had died because he promised a dying man that he would keep his daughter safe." Hadley's eyes found Piper in the crowd. The younger girl was sitting in the front row, tears already streaming down her face. "A few months ago, someone from my dad's past tried to hurt our family. He took my sister, and he threatened to do worse. My father could have responded with violence. He could have become the man he used to be, but instead he chose compassion. He chose forgiveness. He stood in front of the police and asked them to give a broken man a chance to heal." Her voice grew stronger. "I walked into that warehouse because I believed what my father had taught me, that people can change, that everyone deserves a second chance, that the measure of a person isn't where they've been, but where they choose to go." She looked out at her classmates, at the faces that had mocked her, and the faces that had ignored her, and the faces that were looking at her now with something like understanding. "I used to be ashamed of my father. I took the long way to school so I wouldn't have to pass his garage. I changed the subject whenever anyone asked about my family. I let your laughter make me feel small." She straightened her shoulders. "I'm not ashamed anymore. My dad is a biker. He's also a hero, a mentor, a father, and the best man I've ever known. And if any of you have a problem with that, well, that's your problem, not mine." The silence that followed was absolute. Hadley stood at the podium, her heart racing, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. Then from somewhere in the back of the room, someone started clapping. The applause spread like wildfire. One person became 10, became 50, and suddenly the entire assembly hall was on its feet. Students were cheering, teachers were wiping their eyes, and Piper was running toward the stage with her arms outstretched. Hadley stepped away from the podium and caught her sister in a fierce embrace. Over Piper's shoulder, she could see Mr. Crawford nodding with approval. She could see Brinley jumping up and down, screaming something that got lost in the noise. She could even see Preston standing awkwardly near the exit, looking like he wanted to disappear. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that she had finally told her truth, and her truth had set her free. In the days that followed, Hadley noticed changes everywhere she looked. Strangers smiled at her in the hallway. Teachers nodded with respect. Even the lunch lady, a stern woman who had never spoken more than 2 words to her, stopped Hadley one morning and said, "That speech of yours, my son's a veteran. You gave me hope that he can find his way back." It was strange being visible after so many years of trying to disappear. But it was also liberating. Hadley no longer felt the need to hide, to make herself small, to apologize for who she was or where she came from. She walked with her head held high, and for the first time in her life, she understood what her father had meant about the power of owning your story. Piper flourished too. She had started attending a support group for children who had lost parents to PTSD and suicide. The group met every Thursday evening at the community center, and Piper came home each week with new insights and new friends who understood her pain in ways that others could not. She was still sad sometimes, still missed her father with an ache that Hadley knew would never fully heal. But she was healing slowly and steadily, surrounded by people who loved her. The Brennan household had developed new rhythms, new traditions. Sunday morning pancakes had become a sacred ritual, with all three of them crowded into the small kitchen, flour on their faces and laughter in the air. Friday nights were movie nights, complete with popcorn and blankets and arguments about whether to watch comedies or action films. Piper had become skilled at mediating these disputes, her diplomatic nature emerging as she settled into her new family. Colt had started teaching both girls basic motorcycle maintenance, not because he expected them to ride, but because he believed everyone should know how to take care of themselves. Hadley discovered that she had a knack for mechanical work, her hands steady and precise as she learned to change oil and check brake pads. Piper was less interested in the technical aspects, but loved hearing the stories Colt told as he worked tales of the open road and the freedom that came from leaving everything behind and just riding. The video of Hadley's speech went viral within hours. But this time the comments were different. This time people were sharing her words because they were moved by them, not because they wanted to mock her. Messages poured in from across the country, from veterans who had been helped by charity rides in their own communities, from children of former addicts who understood what it meant to love someone with a complicated past, from teachers who wanted to show the speech to their students, from parents who wanted their kids to hear what real courage sounded like. Hadley did not pay much attention to any of it. She had said what she needed to say. The rest was just noise. What she did pay attention to was the letter that arrived 3 days later. It was handwritten, the penmanship shaky but careful. The return address was the rehabilitation center where Wade had been staying for the past 3 months. Dear Hadley, your father showed me the video of your speech. I watched it 7 times. Each time I cried a little more. I have spent most of my life being angry. Angry at the world, angry at your father, angry at myself. That anger ate away at everything good in my life until there was nothing left. My wife, my son, my self-respect, all gone, consumed by a fire I didn't know how to put out. What you said in that warehouse about your father carrying my picture, about him never giving up on me. I didn't believe it at first. I couldn't believe it. Because if it was true, then everything I had told myself for 20 years was a lie. But it was true. Your father came to see me the day after that night. He didn't yell at me or lecture me. He just sat down and held my hand and told me that he forgave me, that he had always forgiven me, that he was sorry he couldn't make me see that sooner. I'm getting better, Hadley. It's slow and some days are harder than others, but for the first time in as long as I can remember, I have hope. I have something to live for, and I have you and your father to thank for that. You asked me if I was brave enough to believe in myself. I'm trying to be. Every day. I'm trying. Thank you for not giving up on me when you had every reason to. With gratitude, Wade Hadley read the letter 3 times before she finally set it down. Then she went to find her father and showed it to him without saying a word. Colt read it slowly, his weathered face softening with each line. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and handed it back to Hadley. "He's going to make it," Colt said quietly. "I can feel it." "Because of you." Colt shook his head. "Because of himself. All I did was show him the door. He's the one who chose to walk through it." Summer arrived with a wave of heat that made the asphalt shimmer and the air thick with humidity. But on the morning of the annual Veterans Charity Ride, the weather was perfect. Clear skies, gentle breeze, the kind of day that felt like a gift. The parking lot of Pete's Diner was overflowing with motorcycles. More than 100 bikes this year, easily the biggest turnout in the ride's history. Word had spread about what had happened with Wade, about Hadley's speech about the Brennan family, and their commitment to redemption. People had come from 3 states away to be part of it. Hadley stood beside her father's Harley wearing a leather jacket that Colt had given her for her 16th birthday. It fit perfectly like it had been made for her. Piper stood on her other side, bouncing with excitement. She had grown so much in the past year, not just physically but emotionally. The haunted look had faded from her eyes, replaced by something that looked a lot like happiness. Colt emerged from the diner deep in conversation with Big Tom. The 2 men were going over the route one final time, making sure every detail was in place. Around them, bikers checked their machines and greeted old friends and welcomed newcomers into the fold. It was family, all of it, every tattooed arm, every leather vest, every weathered face. A family built not from blood but from choice, from shared purpose, from the belief that everyone deserved a chance to be better. Then Hadley saw him. A figure was walking across the parking lot, moving slowly like someone who was not quite sure of his welcome. He was thinner than she remembered, his face clean-shaven, his eyes clear. He wore a simple t-shirt with the Charity Ride logo, no leather jacket, no patches, no symbols of the past. Wade stopped a few feet away from Colt. The 2 men looked at each other for a long moment, decades of history passing between them in silence. Then Colt stepped forward and pulled Wade into an embrace. The parking lot erupted in cheers. Bikers who had known Wade in the old days came forward to shake his hand, to clap him on the back, to welcome him home. Hadley watched as tears streamed down Wade's face, watched as he struggled to accept the love that was being offered so freely. "Is this okay?" Wade asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Me being here?" Colt kept one arm around his friend's shoulders. "This is exactly where you belong." They took their positions for the ride. Colt at the front, as always, with Hadley behind him on the back of the Harley. Piper rode with Big Tom, her face split into a grin that seemed too big for her head. And Wade, still unsteady but determined, climbed onto a borrowed bike near the middle of the pack. The engines roared to life, 100 hearts beating as one. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, beautiful. It was the sound of redemption, of community, of a promise being kept. They pulled out of the parking lot in formation, a river of chrome and leather flowing through the streets of Ridgemont. People lined the sidewalks to watch them pass, waving flags and holding signs. Children pointed in wonder, and elderly veterans stood at attention, their hands pressed to their hearts. Hadley held on to her father, her cheek pressed against his broad back, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath the leather. She thought about everything that had led to this moment: the embarrassment in Mr. Crawford's class, the photographs, the warehouse, the long journey from shame to pride. She thought about her mother buried in the cemetery on the hill, watching over them from wherever she was now. She thought about Bryce Keller, whose death had brought Piper into their lives, whose memory they honored with every mile they rode. She thought about Wade somewhere behind them, in the pack, taking the first steps on a road that would be long and hard but no longer lonely. And she thought about her father, the man who had been given a second chance and had spent the rest of his life earning it. The man who had taught her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The man who had shown her through 1,000 small acts of kindness what it truly meant to be good. The ride wound through the countryside, past farms and fields, and small towns where people came out of their houses to watch. At each stop, donations poured in. Cash, in checks, and promises of support, all destined for the veterans who needed it most. By the time they reached the Veterans Memorial, the procession stretched for nearly 2 miles. Families were waiting there, veterans in wheelchairs and on crutches, young and old, all gathered to honor those who had served and to celebrate the community that refused to forget them. Colt pulled his bike to a stop near the memorial's eternal flame. He cut the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden silence, his head bowed. Hadley knew he was thinking about the men he had lost, the brothers who had not made it out of the darkness. Then he swung his leg over the bike and helped Hadley down. Together they walked to where the other riders were gathering, a sea of leather and denim and hope. Big Tom called for quiet, and the crowd fell silent. "Every year we come together to remember," he said, his deep voice carrying across the memorial. "To remember those who served, those who sacrificed, those who gave everything for this country. But this year we also celebrate. We celebrate the power of redemption, the strength of forgiveness, the courage it takes to change." He gestured toward Colt. "This man saved my life over 20 years ago. I was just a scared 15-year-old trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. And he's spent every day since then saving others. Not with violence, but with patience. Not with anger, but with love. He taught me that the past doesn't have to define us, that every day is a chance to be better than we were yesterday." Big Tom turned to face the crowd. "So today we ride for the veterans who need our help, but we also ride for everyone who's ever been told they can't change, who's ever been written off as hopeless, who's ever looked in the mirror and wondered if there was any good left in them." His voice rose with conviction. "We ride to prove them wrong." The cheering was thunderous. Engines revved in celebration, a mechanical roar that shook the ground beneath their feet. Hadley found herself crying and laughing at the same time, overwhelmed by the joy and the sorrow and the fierce, unshakable hope. Later, after the speeches were finished and the donations were counted, Hadley found herself standing alone by the memorial. The names of the fallen were etched into the granite, thousands of them, each one a life cut short, a story left unfinished. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Wade standing there. He looked nervous, uncertain, like a man who was not sure he had the right to be in this place. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly, "for what you did in the warehouse and after." Hadley shook her head. "You don't have to thank me." "Yeah, I do." Wade's voice cracked slightly. "You could have let them take me to prison. You could have hated me for what I did to your family. But instead, you showed me that picture. You reminded me of who I used to be." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph. The same photograph, now protected by a plastic sleeve. "Your father gave this to me," Wade said. "Told me to keep it, to remember that I'm not alone." Hadley looked at the image. Two young men with their arms around each other, grinning at a future they could not have imagined. So much had happened since that picture was taken. So much pain, so much loss, so much wasted time. But also redemption, also forgiveness, also love. "You're part of this family now," Hadley said. "For real this time. No more running, no more hiding, just us taking care of each other." Wade's eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve that." "Maybe not," Hadley admitted. "But that's kind of the point, isn't it? None of us deserve the grace we're given. We just have to try to be worthy of it." She reached out and took his hand. His fingers were rough and scarred, but his grip was gentle. "My dad believes in you," she said. "Piper believes in you, and I believe in you too. So stop trying to earn it and just accept it. That's all any of us can do." Wade stood there for a long moment, struggling with emotions he had spent a lifetime trying to suppress. Then slowly he nodded. "Okay," he whispered, "okay." They walked back to the gathering together, two unlikely allies bound by a shared commitment to something bigger than themselves. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The veterans and their families were starting to disperse, heading home with full hearts and renewed hope. Colt stood by his motorcycle waiting. Piper was already perched on the back of Big Tom's bike, laughing at something he had said. When Colt saw Hadley and Wade approaching, his weathered face broke into a smile. "Ready to head home?" he asked. Hadley looked at her father. At this man who had been given a second chance and had spent every moment since then trying to deserve it. At this biker with the leather jacket and the tattoos and the heart as big as the open road. "Yeah," she said, "I'm ready." She climbed onto the back of the Harley and wrapped her arms around her father's chest. Wade mounted his own bike nearby, looking more comfortable now, more at home. The engines roared to life one final time. The setting sun cast long shadows across the memorial as the riders prepared to depart. In a few minutes, they would begin scattered to their various homes and lives. But something would remain, something permanent and precious. A family, not built from blood, but from choice, from forgiveness, from the radical belief that people could change if only someone believed in them. Hadley pressed her cheek against her father's back and closed her eyes. She thought about that day in history class, what felt like a lifetime ago. She had said her dad was a biker, and everyone had laughed. They were not laughing now, because her dad was a biker. He was also a hero, a mentor, a protector, and the best man she had ever known. He had taught her that strength was not about violence or intimidation, but about having the courage to change. He had shown her that family was not about blood, but about the promises you make and the love you choose to give. And she had never been more proud to be his daughter. The motorcycles pulled away from the memorial in a long, thundering line. Hadley held on tight as the wind rushed past, as the road stretched out before them, as the last light of day painted the world in gold. Behind her, Wade rode steady and true, no longer running from his past. Beside them, Piper laughed with pure joy, finally free from her grief. And ahead, leading them all, her father rode toward home, toward tomorrow, toward whatever came next. The road was open and the journey was far from over. But for the first time in as long as Hadley could remember, she was not afraid of where it might lead, because she knew now that she would not be making the journey alone. She had her father, she had her sister, she had a family built from broken pieces and held together by love. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear, Hadley thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. The classroom where she had spoken 3 simple words and watched her world crumble. The photographs that had revealed her father's darkest chapter. The warehouse where she had faced down a broken man and offered him something no one else had: hope. She thought about her mother, the woman she barely remembered, but whose influence shaped every part of who she had become. Laurel had seen something in Colt that no one else could see, and she had loved him enough to help him become the man he was meant to be. That was her legacy. That was the gift she had passed on to her daughter. And Hadley understood now that she had inherited that gift. The ability to see the good in people, even when they could not see it themselves. The courage to reach out to someone drowning in darkness and pull them toward the light. The faith to believe that change was possible, that redemption was real, that every person deserved at least one more chance. The motorcycles rumbled on through the gathering dusk, a river of chrome and leather flowing toward home. Hadley tightened her arms around her father and smiled. She had spent so many years being ashamed of who he was. But now she understood that his past, all of it, the darkness and the violence and the desperate search for belonging, had shaped him into the man who had raised her. The man who had loved her unconditionally. The man who had shown her through his own transformation that the measure of a person was not where they had been, but where they chose to go. My dad is a biker, she thought, the words no longer carrying any shame. And I have never been more proud. The last of the daylight faded, and the stars came out one by one, pinpricks of light against the vast darkness of the sky. The road stretched on ahead, winding through hills and valleys, past farms and fields, toward a future that was uncertain but full of promise. Hadley closed her eyes and let the rhythm of the ride carry her forward. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obstacles, new opportunities to prove that she was her father's daughter in every way that mattered. There would be moments of doubt and fear, moments when the old shame tried to creep back in. But she would face them the same way her father had faced his demons, with courage, with compassion, with the unshakable belief that it was never too late to become who you were meant to be. The engines hummed beneath them, a lullaby of power and freedom. And as the Brennan family rode toward home, surrounded by the brothers and sisters they had chosen, Hadley knew that she had found something precious. Not just a family, a purpose. And that was enough. That was everything.